Hey friend, good morning. Meg here from Homestead, and I'm making some sourdough baguettes, so I'm gonna bring you along with me. These are 5-ingredient baguettes, which is really awesome because it doesn't take a whole lot of fancy ingredients. You're gonna need an active sourdough starter. This is my sourdough starter. It is nice and bubbly and active. A tip for figuring out if your starter is ready or not is put a little rubber band on your container, because if your rubber band marks the level that you're starting at, then it's really easy to see when it's doubled. Mine is clearly doubled, and I've got lots of little air bubbles on here. And one little tip, if you didn't know, it's better to have a really thick starter that's hard to stir versus one that's really runny and easy to pour. So let's open this up and I'll show you. Can you see the bubbles? See all the bubbles in there? That's how I can tell that my starter is active and ready to go. Another test that you can do is you can do the float test, where you take a spoonful of your sourdough starter and you drop it in a glass of water. If it floats, it's ready. If it sinks, you need to feed it again before you continue on with your recipe. I'm losing my train of thought. We need all-purpose flour, sourdough starter that's active, salt, sugar, and water. I want my water to be slightly warmer than body temperature, so like 100 degrees is perfect. If you're not sure what that feels like, can you stick your finger in it comfortably and it feels warm but not hot? That's kind of how you can know. You can either add your sourdough starter by weight, which is 240 grams, or you can do it by cups, and it's 1 cup. Stir it into your warm water until everything is really well combined. It should look very cloudy and smooth, and you shouldn't see any pieces of sourdough starter anymore. Now we're going to grab our kitchen scale, and you can either add 3½ cups of flour, or if you want to go by weight to be a little bit more precise, it's going to be 420 grams. Then we're going to add our salt, which is 2 teaspoons, and we're going to add our sugar, which is another 2 teaspoons. I've included in the recipe how to do this either by weight or how to do it by typical American measurements, whichever is easiest for you. The best tool for whisking all of this together is going to be something called a Dutch whisk. It kind of looks like a circle and maybe like an old bubble wand that you used to have when you were a kid. It really just helps to add the water and the flour together without it getting too clumpy and without it sticking too bad. In sourdough terms, the type of dough that we're trying to make here is something called a shaggy dough. It's going to be a little bit rough and a little bit sticky, and overall just feel really nice and soft. And we're going to work it on the countertop with a little bit of flour. Feel free to add some more if your dough is too sticky. If it doesn't feel sticky enough, add a little bit of water. To get proper gluten development in this dough, we're going to kind of work it with the heel of our hands while turning it over on itself, and then we're going to take the edges and fold them towards the center a few times. The whole time I'm adding just a little bit of flour if I need to, but again, I'm trying not to overwork the dough, and I don't want to make it too dense by adding too much flour. After a few minutes of kneading, I'm transferring it to a square-sided plastic container. I did go ahead and add a little olive oil just to keep it from sticking. This is my dough. One of my favorite things for baking sourdough is to use a clear container so that I can actually see how much the dough has risen. So when I started, we were just shy of 1 liter, and now we're somewhere around here. So my dough has almost doubled, which is perfect for this recipe. Our dough has risen, and we are going to make it into our baguette shapes. This is where you get to have a little bit of fun and creativity with the recipe. I am making 2 standard size baguettes. Another option would be to make 4 that are sandwich sized, or even 6 hot dog buns, which this recipe is really, really good for. I'm going to divide the dough into the sizes that I need, and then I'm going to take one of these shapes and I am going to form my baguette. To do this, we're going to flour our surface, and then we are going to kind of smush it out into a big rectangle. Once we get our rectangle shape, we are going to fold each of the sides in towards the center. You can choose if you want to start with the long sides or the short sides, but the idea is to just fold it in on itself, and then we're going to roll it over, and we're just going to kind of tug and push and pull until everything is nice and smooth and the seams are even. If this part seems a little bit confusing, one thing that you could do is just go ahead and make it into a cinnamon roll shape. Roll your rectangle and then just roll the long side on top of itself until you've created a snake, which is what my kids call it, or basically a cinnamon roll shape. And then we're going to kind of pinch the seam shut, and we're going to let it rise until it's doubled again. This part can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and it mostly depends on the temperature of your kitchen and the humidity in the air. Welcome back. The baguettes are out of the oven and they are cooling. I ended up doing a pan change. I know that I said I was going to use this pan right here, But after they started rising, I could tell that they were just too big. They got too long, and I could tell that if I left them in that pan, instead of having this nice rounded shape, they would have ended up boxy, like a loaf of sandwich bread. So what I did here was I transferred them to a baking sheet, and actually I kind of hindsight wish that I had an even longer baking sheet. I think these would have looked better a little bit bigger. Another thing I did is I cut a slit down the center, but I didn't do it deep enough, so next time I'm gonna make sure to go closer to 1/4 of an inch, because I thought that I did enough, but I clearly did not, because you can't even see it. When you bake bread, a good thing to consider is not cutting into it until it's fully cooled. And the reason for that is because the gluten development in there is still forming. The heat and the steam and everything that's trapped in here, if I were to cut this and open it, it would probably still taste really good and it would probably be fine, but it would end up kind of doughy and just not as developed as it will if I let it sit the rest of the time. So we're gonna let this sit probably another hour or so, and then we'll slice into it and see what we have. A little tip if you are kind of on a time crunch with sourdough, if you plan ahead, you can have it be ready to bake whenever you're ready for it. So I mixed these up last night about 6 o'clock in the evening. I let them sit on the counter for 2 hours to rise, just in this container right here. And then before we went to bed, I stuck it in the refrigerator, because what that does is it slows down the fermentation. That way I don't have to be on a timetable of like getting up at midnight to start continuing the steps for my dough. Then I took it out of the fridge about 6 o'clock this morning, and it's 10:45 right now, so it took about 4 hours for it to warm up and rise. And once I hit that doubling point, that was when I was ready to continue. So if I wanted to, I could totally be making these for lunch today. So I'm gonna answer a few questions that I usually get when it comes to working with sourdough. And the first one is, how can you tell when your dough is proofed? You have to get your dough proofed correctly in order for it to have the right texture, the right flavor, that right crustiness that you're going for. There's a really easy way to do this, and it's called the poke test, where all you're gonna do is you're gonna have your shaped loaf, and you're gonna take your thumb and you're gonna press your thumb into a corner and then release it. And I'm not saying like poke it really hard, but just like push it in firmly, release. If you can still see the indentation where your thumb was, but it gradually rises back up, you're good to go. And if you poke it with your thumb and it springs back really quickly, you might need to go longer with your proofing. Another question that I get is, how do you get that light and airy crumb? Because we've all been to restaurants where they serve a piece of crusty baguette bread with their salad or with their main dish, and you tear it apart and it's like the crust is perfect. It's a little bit crunchy, but not quite. It's got a little bit of a bite to it. But then in the inside, it's just like really pillowy and soft and airy. And how do you do that when you're making a baguette at home? So to get that light and airy open crumb, what we're gonna do is we're gonna concentrate on our hydration, and we're gonna concentrate on our gluten development. How we do that is we make sure that we have the proper amount of water, which is, instead of eyeballing it, we're actually gonna measure. And then for the gluten development, we're gonna be careful with how we're handling our dough, as well as how we're treating it when it's in the bulk fermentation. This looks like not smashing it down. We don't want to pretend like it's Play-Doh. We're not making a brick. We're not packing a snowball. We want to treat it like it's full of air, and like that's a good thing. We don't want to damage. During the bulk fermentation phase, the whole point is for it to develop a good gluten structure, which allows the dough to trap and hold air, which is the whole point of the yeast. Okay, another question that I get is, can you make sourdough without a sourdough starter? Yes, you can, but it's no longer considered sourdough. You're then baking a yeast bread, which is also delicious. There's tons of good yeast baguette recipes out there. But if you're wanting to have a traditional sourdough baguette, you're gonna need to start with a sourdough starter. If you've never made one before, it's very simple. It's just taking flour and water in certain ratios, mixing them together, and then over the course of 3, 4, 5, maybe up to 7 days, you're removing a portion while feeding it a new portion every single day until you get the bubbles that I was showing you earlier. Just go to my website, nanaskahmade.com, and search sourdough starter, and you can find it. It'll just walk you through the whole thing. So here's a big tip for you. When you're working with sourdough, you want it to have that perfect sourdough crust. You want it to be kind of something that you have to chew a little bit to get into, but then once you get through the center, it's like soft and airy in there. The trick is storage. When you store your sourdough bread, you don't want to keep it in the fridge. You don't want to leave it just on the counter, because that can dry it out. Sourdough is best consumed within a day or two. That's when it's at peak freshness. But if you want to store it a little bit longer, your best bet is going to be in a bread box or an airtight container at room temperature in the counter, in the dark, not in the sunshine. I did write a post about how to store bread in your kitchen. It's on my website, nanaskahmade.com. Search how to store bread. It'll answer all of your questions, kind of bust a few myths that maybe you've heard, and then teach you the best way to store it so that you can enjoy it to its full potential. I do have one top tip that I want to share with you for the baking process, and that's to increase the steam in your oven. Now, none of us are professional bakers, I'm assuming here, and so we don't have a steam function on our oven. And so what we have to do to mimic that steam setting is get creative. What I do is I put my baguette pan on a cookie sheet that's bigger than my pan, and I put that in the oven to preheat. And once I put my baguettes in the oven, I pour water into the cookie sheet, and that releases steam, and that's going to help naturally steam them, which adds more moisture. It's going to give them a better crust. It's what we all want when we're baking baguette. If you are fancy and you have like an actual baguette baker or like a Dutch oven, something enameled cast with a lid, you don't really need to worry about this because you're going to be able to steam it in that pan anyways. I do not, so I have to get a little bit more creative when I'm baking. Now here's a few ways that you can take this recipe and make it your own. If you want to have sandwiches, like a Subway style sandwich, take this baguette recipe but divide it into smaller pieces. I would go 4 and see how you like it. You could even make them smaller and divide it into 6 sections. Shape them like a bun. You could use them as hot dog buns. They make great hot dog brat buns. You could use it for a dipping bread. So if you're making a soup or a salad and you just want that nice French baguette for the side, these are perfect for that. These also make really good croutons. So if by some chance you don't get your baguettes eaten in time, cut them into 1-inch pieces or tear them and then toast them in your oven with some salt and pepper and olive oil, maybe a little garlic powder, and then use them as croutons on your favorite soup or salad. And then there's always bread pudding, because old sourdough bread makes the best bread pudding. Check out my website, nenascame.com, and search bread pudding, and you will find a recipe that will knock your socks off. Well guys, thanks for hanging out with me in my kitchen today. I hope that this was useful. I hope that you learned how to make sourdough baguettes. And I just hope that it gave you the courage to dive in and do some sourdough, because it always sounds really intimidating until you're actually getting your hands in there and doing it. And then you're like, why didn't I do this sooner? If you liked this, subscribe to my channel. Please like it, leave me a comment, tell me what your experience was. And you can always get this full recipe post on my website, nenascame.com. Just go there, use the search bar function, and type in baguettes, and you will find it. Have a wonderful day.